how you stack your parking up. The agenda appeared to be to actually diminish car use by control of parking standards at the origin as well as the destination. Now that's a big debate issue. The agenda appears to some to be still the agenda, to others no longer an agenda. Big question mark there. Of course, Better Streets, Better Places raised it as a substantial barrier in that work, and I read Better Streets and a bit about parking yesterday. Frighteningly, the words are still applicable. Of course, that work brought forward Manual for Streets and some of the residential car parking guidance that's come since. We had 04, the kicking in of the new planning process, the spatial planning approach, and the substantial evidence that that relied on rather than the previous land use. The front loading, the evidence base that for some of us has been almost bread and butter for too many years already. That funnel down to the public examination built on a substantial raft of evidence and the gathering of evidence base. 4 years ago, MFS work kicked in, and of course at the centre of many of the strands of that was residential parking. We in Dorset kicked off in March 06 with thinking we've got to do something about parking and parking standards, and we started to look around, we started to get a game plan together. Concurrent with that, English Partnerships document, many of you, perhaps all of you will be familiar with, brought forward a very good piece of work and cited 3 of our developments as case studies. We're always a bit touchy when somebody touches on us as case studies. Some of us listened to Alan 3.5 years ago at IHE's annual DC conference, talking about where he and Phil Jones were going with the work on the subject behind Manual for Streets and other strands, based of course on Phil's paper to the previous year's TRICS conference. So it was slowly emerging. I listened to Alan talking about what was going on with Oxfordshire, and thought this is interesting, because we have this need and perhaps we could in parallel harness and go forward on that sort of work. By the end of 06, of course, we had the new PPS 3 come out with a very significant change of emphasis onto that we'd had previously. We back at base were thinking, yes, we've done a lot of accessibility work, we know a lot of data, what can we do with it? By December 06, we'd appointed Alan and Phil as consultants to the Dorset residential car parking study. It just grows in title, it's horrendous, but the fundamental point for me was that we had all the district planning authorities, the county highway authority and the 2 unitary authorities all coming together to do one piece of work to bring consistency. By March 07, of course, Manual for Streets was published with all of that it had connecting to parking, and justifiably later the substantial awards and accolades that it got. The section on parking was, I think, very important because along with the rest of the manual gave very clear direction as to where residential development could go in that respect and the methodologies behind it. By May 07, at long last, after a lot of angst, the CLG paper came out based on Alan and Phil's methodology, which had already been mentioned in the EP document and in Manual for Streets and linked back to PPS. So we had a raft of documents, very clear about a methodology, a suggestion. By the summer-autumn of 07, we started through the LDF process to connect with the initial consultations, the issues and options consultations with at least 3 of our districts to have the base that accorded with the paragraph 51 communities engagement stipulation. Very proud that by September 07, in addition to all of the local planning authority and highway authorities making up the partnership for our study, we were joined by 3 developers, very significant for us because it was the Duchy and 2 very, very good local developers who put a lot of emphasis into quality of the development. And as far as I'm concerned, that balance of public and private sector, both with equal vested interest, was a very, very important step. So for me, that was the second milestone in our work. We did a lot of work to extend the original methodology that Alan and Phil put together, because there were debates going on around the country about how do you carve a patch up to analyse the local needs and the local data. My colleagues in R&I in Dorset, particularly Pete Jackson, got together with Tom Thorney from WSP and came up with a methodology I now call the Jackson-Thorney methodology of using DEFRA classification areas, those are classifications of rurality in effect, put together with ONS data and they went into all sorts of very deep polygons and little super output areas. Completely lost me, but it gave a solid methodology that somebody else could pick up and run with, and took out the debate of how do we carve up an area according to function. By proxy, it was effectively an accessibility map by default. We did a lot of site surveying. It was interesting on the train coming up. I noticed that Essex surveyed something like 24 sites or thereabouts. Oxfordshire did the same number. We did initially 21. We added to it later. By mid-08, John Dale had a major sounding off about the whole issue in LTT, which every point I think most of us would agree with. It's about quality and functionality. John, for his sins, then ended up chairing our annual DC conference in May 08. Well, Muggins stood up and said, we're just about to go out to consultation with our work. I wish I had not done that. The only lasting value of that was the first outing I did with Dave Brubeck at the conference. But hey, moving on through 08, more guidance coming out from the new PPS 12 about what core strategies should be, and that evidence-based, and how the definition of soundness was very clearly laid down. How the evidence base should feed into the core strategy and upwards, so that you had effectively a pyramid feeding up to the top, which could be judged and tested at examination. And I think any of us who've been in DC always worry about what happens when we're in front of an inspector. As far as I'm concerned as a policy planner, I'm now worried about what I should say in front of an inspector at examination.